She was 4 steps down the marble staircase with another man's secrets writing in a leather clutch against her hip when a voice above her said her name, not the name on the laminated badge clipped to her dress. Not the name the embassy had printed on 300 place cards in the ballroom below. Her name, the real one, the one that lived in a sealed file in a building in Moscow, the one nobody in this city was supposed to know. And in the half-second it took her body to understand what her ears had already heard, Sarah Chen did the math the way she'd been trained to do it, cold and fast and without flinching. 11 seconds before he could cross the landing, draw a phone, and turn her cover story into a corpse. She used 6. I want to tell you about those 6 seconds. But before I do, I have to tell you something about the file they came out of, because the file is the strange part, the part that kept me up nights when this story first landed on my desk. Most of what I bring you, friend, leaves a paper trail. There's an after-action report. There's a citation, even if it's redacted down to a black bar and a date. Somebody, somewhere, signed a form. This one's different. This one came to me with half the lines blacked out, and the other half so vague they might as well have been weather reports. And the only reason I'm allowed to say her name at all is that the name itself was the one piece they decided to declassify, like they wanted exactly one human being attached to a story that officially never happened. Captain Sarah Chen, United States Army. Intelligence. Linguist, Mandarin, Russian, Farsi, the kind of fluency that doesn't come from a course, the kind that comes from a childhood and a decade and a stubbornness most people don't have. Vienna, the autumn of 2019. You remember Dana from the last one? The woman on the range, the mile she shouldn't have had, the form that stayed blank because the world wasn't ready to write down what she'd done? Dana had time. Dana had a quarter of an hour of silence and a steady wind and the long luxury of patience. Sarah had 6 seconds. This file shouldn't exist. The fact that you're hearing it at all means somebody, somewhere up the chain, decided that it should, decided that what this woman did across a ballroom mattered as much as anything men have done across a battlefield. Some wars are won that way, friend. Not with a rifle. With a glass of champagne raised 1 inch off level, and the nerve to walk down a staircase while a man who could kill you decides, for reasons of his own, to let you live. Sit with me a while. Let me lay it out the way it happened. You have to understand what a place like the Palais Coburg does to a person before you can understand what Sarah was doing inside it. It is not a building so much as a statement, a great pale wedding cake of a thing dropped into the heart of Vienna by people who had more money than the rest of Europe could imagine and wanted every visitor to feel that fact in their knees. Cream marble that swallows the sound of footsteps. Gilt railings worked into shapes that mean nothing and cost everything. Chandeliers the size of small cars, each crystal cut by hand by someone dead 200 years. The kind of grandeur that is built to make the individual feel small, and it works, it always works, on everyone, on the diplomats and the ministers and the trade attaches who came that night in their good suits and their borrowed confidence. It worked on all of them. It did not work on Sarah Chen, and that was the first thing that made her dangerous, though no one in that ballroom would have guessed it to look at her. Because to look at her, she was the least dangerous person in the room. That was the entire point. She stood near the interpreter station along the eastern wall in a fitted dark dress that was elegant enough to belong and plain enough to vanish. Low heels she could actually move in. A small clutch that no one would think twice about, and she wore the particular invisibility of her trade like a second skin. She was the translator, the woman who speaks in other people's words. There is no one in any room on earth that people stop seeing faster than the person hired to carry their sentences from one language into another. You look at the minister. You look at the man the minister is talking to. The voice that bridges them comes from somewhere off to the side, disembodied, functional, furniture. A microphone with a pulse. Sarah had built her whole working life on that blindness, and she had learned to stand inside it the way other people stand inside a darkened room, comfortable, oriented, watching everything while the watch watched nothing at all. She had been in Vienna for 9 weeks. The cover was airtight because it was almost entirely true. She really was a freelance conference interpreter, accredited, insured, with a flat in the 3rd district and a landlord who thought she was lovely and quiet, and a string of legitimate jobs at the UN office and the OSC that filled her calendar and her bank records with the dull, verifiable texture of a real life. That was the craft of it. The best legend isn't a lie you maintain. It's a truth you live, with one small room at the center that the rest of the house is built to hide. Sarah's small room was the noticing. The way she could sit in a booth translating a tedious panel on agricultural tariffs and, without once breaking the rhythm of her own voice, catalog every person who entered, every phone left face up on every table, every conversation that dropped half a register when a particular name came up. She remembered faces the way other people remember melodies, involuntarily, completely, forever. It was the thing that had pulled her out of the linguistics track and into the building that doesn't have a sign, and it was the thing that was about to nearly kill her. The job that night was small. That was what they told her, and that was what she believed, and she would think later, much later, about how often the small jobs are the ones that open up under your feet. There was a device. A storage drive, hardened, encrypted, no larger than a playing card, sitting in a docking cradle inside a private office on the 3rd floor of the Palais, an office that belonged for the duration of the conference to a delegation that was not, strictly speaking, the delegation it claimed to be. On that drive was a set of files. She was not told what was on them. She was never told what was on them, and she had stopped asking that kind of question years before, because the answer was always the same nothing, and the asking only marked you as someone who wanted to know more than your slice of the operation required. Her slice was this: get to the office during a specific 40-minute window when the floor would be thin, clone the drive with a device that lived in the false bottom of her clutch, and be back at the interpreter station before anyone who mattered noticed she'd stepped away to find a quieter corner and a glass of water. Clone, not take. That was the elegance of it. A stolen drive is a scream. A clone drive is a whisper, and a whisper that no one ever hears is the only kind of theft that lets you do it twice. Let me show you the math, because the math is where the truth of these things lies. The window existed because of a reception schedule and the predictable laziness of human beings. At 9 o'clock, the formal toasts began in the main ballroom, and at 9 o'clock the security detail assigned to the upper floors would do what security details do everywhere in the world when the principals are all gathered in one bright loud room 2 floors below. They would consolidate. They would drift toward the noise, toward the doors that mattered, toward the warmth of being where the important people were. The 3rd floor corridor that ran past the office was covered by a single roaming guard whose loop Sarah had timed across 3 previous evenings of perfectly innocent attendance, ran 8 minutes long. 8 minutes from the moment he passed the office door, walked the length of the east corridor, checked the service stair, came back along the west side, and returned to his start. 8 minutes was her envelope. The cloning device needed 90 seconds to read and copy the drive once she had it seated. Getting from the ballroom to the office was 4 minutes if she didn't hurry, and hurrying was the one thing you never, ever did. So, 4 minutes up, 90 seconds at the cradle, 4 minutes down, with a margin she'd built and rebuilt in her head until it was as familiar as a song. It was clean. It was boring. It was the kind of operation that ends with a forgettable evening and a quiet flight home, and that is exactly the kind of operation that nobody ever makes a movie about, which is precisely why the good ones love them. She had one tool that mattered and a dozen that didn't, and the one that mattered was the clutch. To anyone in that ballroom, it was an evening bag, dark leather gone soft at the corners from real use, the slightly scuffed edge of an object that belonged to a working woman and not a wealthy one. Inside, behind a panel that opened only under a particular flex of the lining, sat the cloner, matte black, the size of a folded map, a single recessed port and one indicator that would glow when the copy was running and go dark when it was done. No screen. No sound. The men who built it understood that in her world a beep is a confession. She wore no jewelry that could catch light or snag. She wore a watch that was a cheap quartz thing chosen precisely because it was a cheap quartz thing. The kind of watch that says I am not a person worth robbing. The kind of watch that the men in the room with their heavy automatic chronometers would never glance at twice. Everything about her was an argument for her own irrelevance, assembled detail by a professional who knew that the most expensive thing you can wear into a room like that is attention, and that the whole art was in spending none of it. And then there was the man, though she did not know yet that he was the man. She clocked him the way she clocked everyone, at 8:41 in the evening, 19 minutes before her window opened, and she filed him the way she filed everyone. Face, build, posture, the particular grammar of how a body holds itself in a room. He was tall and broad through the shoulders in the way that men go broad when they have spent a life in uniform, and then a decade out of it, the muscles settling but never quite softening. 50s. Gray hair cut short and exact. A charcoal suit cut by someone who knew what they were doing, worn by someone who clearly did not care that they had. And he was, Sarah noted with the flat instinctive disapproval of her trade, too loud. Not loud in volume. His voice when she caught it crossing the floor was low and even, but loud in presence, loud in the way he took up the space around him, the way the people he spoke to angled toward him, the way a small weather system of deference moved with him through the crowd. In her experience, the men who command a room like that are almost never the men you have to worry about. The men you have to worry about are the ones you don't notice at all. So she noted him, mild and professional, the way you note a tall building, there, large, irrelevant to your route, and she looked away, and she did not look at him again until it was very nearly too late. That, friend, is the thing about the worst moments of our lives. We almost always walk right past them first. Here is something I have learned from telling these stories, and I'll hand it to you for free before we climb that staircase together. The most dangerous person in any room is almost never the one who looks dangerous. We are wired wrong for this. 10,000 years of staying alive taught us to watch the big man, the loud man, the one with his shoulders squared and his voice filling the air, because for most of human history that man was in fact the threat, and our nerves still light up when he walks in. But the rooms change faster than the nerves did. In a marble ballroom full of men who win their wars, with signatures and secrets, the threat is the one your eyes slide off of. The threat is the translator. The threat is the woman pouring herself a glass of water in the corner, the one nobody can quite remember seeing afterward, the one whose entire profession is the art of being furniture with a memory. Sarah Chen had spent her career being the thing the room didn't see. And the colonel, because that's what he was, though she didn't know it yet, Colonel Andrei Volkov of a directorate I'm not going to name, because the file won't let me, had spent his career being the thing the room couldn't ignore. Hold those two facts side by side. They're going to collide on a staircase in about 15 minutes. And what happens when they do is the whole reason I'm telling you this. Now, let's go up. At 8 minutes to 9, she set her empty glass on a passing tray and began to drift. And the drifting was a performance she had rehearsed without ever rehearsing it, the way a dancer who has done a thing 10,000 times no longer thinks about her feet. She did not walk toward the staircase. She walked toward a small knot of people near the foot of it, exchanged a sentence of pleasant nothing with a Belgian trade officer she'd interpreted for that afternoon, laughed at something that wasn't funny, and let the conversation carry her 3 steps closer to the stairs than she'd started. Then she excused herself the way a working woman excuses herself, with the small apologetic gesture of someone whose feet hurt and whose evening is long, and she went up. Not furtively. Furtive is a flare in the night. She went up the way a guest goes up to find a quieter restroom than the crowded one off the ballroom, unhurried, one hand light on the brass rail, her face wearing the mild, distracted pleasantness of a person thinking about absolutely nothing. The marble took her footsteps and gave back silence. The noise of the reception fell away below her like water closing over a dropped stone, and by the second floor landing she was alone, and by the third she had stepped out of the world of the party entirely, and into the cool dim corridor where the real evening's work was waiting. The third floor was exactly as she'd left it across 3 nights of patient mapping. Long corridor, rudder carpet the color of old wine swallowing what little sound there was, a row of tall doors, most of them dark. The light up here was low and warm and meant for no one, the kind of light a great house keeps burning in rooms it isn't using. She moved down the east side counting under her breath, not numbers, a rhythm, the 8-minute song she'd built. The roaming guard had passed the office door she'd watched him from the bottom of the stairs 4 minutes ago, give or take 15 seconds, which put him now somewhere down the far end checking the service stair, which gave her the office to herself for the better part of 3 more minutes before he came back along the west side. The door to the office was the 4th on the left. It was not locked, because the delegation inside it had been coming and going all evening, and locking it would have meant carrying a key and remembering to use it, and human beings are lazy about the things they believe are already safe. That laziness was the whole operation. She put her hand flat against the door, felt for the give of an occupied room and found none, and went in. I want to be precise about this part, because precision is the thing that separates what Sarah did from the fantasy version your mind wants to supply. There was no laser grid. There was no countdown clock on a screen. There was a handsome dim office with a desk, 2 chairs, a window overlooking the inner courtyard, and on a side table a slim docking cradle with a drive seated in it, exactly where the briefing said it would be, a small dark rectangle no bigger than a deck of cards, with a single status light burning a steady patient amber. She crossed to it without hurrying. You never hurry. Hurrying is how you knock something over. Hurrying is how you forget which way the chair was turned. And she opened the clutch, and she worked the false panel with the particular flex of fingers she'd practiced until it was thoughtless, and she drew out the cloner. The drive lifted from its cradle with a faint reluctance, the small suction of a snug fit. She seated it against the cloner's port. She pressed it home until she felt rather than heard the seat. And the indicator on the cloner came alive, one small light glowing in the dim, and the 90-second song began. 90 seconds is no time at all, and it is an eternity, and which one it is depends entirely on whether you have anything to do during it. Sarah had nothing to do during it, and that is the cruelest kind of 90 seconds there is. The copy ran on its own. She could not make it run faster. She could only stand in a stranger's office in a foreign country holding another nation's secrets in the palm of her hand, while a small light glowed and a clock she could feel but not see ran down somewhere behind her sternum. She did what professionals do with empty seconds. She used them. She turned, slow, and read the room the way she read everything, the angle of the desk chair so she could leave it as she'd found it, the position of a coffee cup gone cold, the single sheet of paper face down beside it that she did not touch and did not turn over because turning it over was the kind of greedy improvisation that turns a clean 90 seconds into a disaster. Her slice. Her envelope. Clone the drive and get gone. The light glowed. Somewhere below, muffled by 3 floors of marble, she felt more than heard the change in the crowd's noise that meant the toasts had begun, right on schedule, the principals all gathered in the bright loud room, the upper floors gone thin. Everything was on time. Everything was clean. The light went dark. She breathed out once, slow. She lifted the cloner, and the drive came free of it, and she turned and seated the drive back into its cradle with the same faint suck of a snud fit, exactly as she'd found it, the amber status light resuming its steady patient burn as though nothing in the world had happened to it, because in every way that anyone would ever be able to detect, nothing had. She folded the cloner back into the false panel. She flexed the lining shut. She stood for 1/2 second in the dim and let her eyes do their final pass. Chair, cup, paper, cradle, light, and found it all as it should be, a room with a secret in it that did not know it had been read. Then she crossed to the door, listened, heard the long carpeted silence of a corridor with no one in it, and stepped out, and pulled the door soft behind her, and began to walk back toward the stairs with 3 full minutes still standing in her envelope, and a clone of something she'd never see writing warm against her hip. She would tell the debriefers, later, in the part of the file that isn't blacked out, that she could not have explained why she looked up. There was no sound. The guard was nowhere. Still on his loop, she'd have sworn it. Still 4 corners and a service stare away. There was nothing her ears caught or her training flagged. There was only the animal thing underneath the training, the older system, the one that kept her ancestors alive in rooms with no marble in them at all, and that system pulled her eyes up off the runner carpet and toward the head of the staircase as she reached it, and that is where she saw him. The loud man from the ballroom. The tall one with the gray hair and the charcoal suit, and the small with their system of deference, except now there was no deference and no crowd, just him, alone, standing at the top of the stairs she needed to go down, one hand resting easy on the gilt rail. Looking at her with an expression she could not read because it was an expression she had never been shown before by a man in her line of work. He was not surprised. That was the first thing that landed, and it landed like cold water. He had not stumbled onto her. He had been waiting. And then he opened his mouth, and in a Russian gone soft and almost gentle, almost kind, he said her name. Her real name. The one from the sealed file. The one nobody in this city was supposed to know. And here is where the clock I promised you starts. So let me set it down in front of you exactly, the way it sat in front of her in the space behind her eyes where she lived when everything else fell away. 11 seconds. That was her honest read, made in the time it takes a heart to beat once. And I want you to understand it wasn't panic arithmetic, it was the cold, clean, professional kind. 11 seconds was roughly how long it would take a man of his size and age to do the things a man in his position would now logically do. Cross the 4 feet of landing to where a house phone hung on the wall, or draw the mobile that every one of them carried, and make the one call, or push the one button that would turn the soft Vienna evening into a hard thing with doors closing all over the building, and her face on every screen, and her clone of secrets becoming the single most damning object in Central Europe. 11 seconds from his first word to her cover story bleeding out on the marble. She heard her own name finish in the air between them. And she did not freeze, and she did not run, because both of those were death, and instead she did the only thing left, the thing they can't teach you, the thing that is either in you when the floor opens or it is not. She thought, fast and cold and complete, in a span of time so short it has no honest name, and I'm going to slow it all the way down for you now, because you have earned the right to watch it happen. First, he knew her. Not the legend, the woman. Which meant he'd seen the file, the real one, the sealed one. Which meant he was not hotel security and not a confused guest. He was a professional, and a senior one, the kind of man who gets handed 3-year-old dossiers on foreign officers and remembers the faces. Second, a professional who'd found a foreign intelligence officer mid-operation in a secured building does not say her name. He does not announce himself. He raises an alarm, quietly, and lets the building do the work, and he is the last thing she ever sees coming. Saying her name was not a capture. Saying her name was a message. Third, and this was the one that turned the whole locked door of the moment on its hinge, a man does not send a message to a person he is about to destroy. He sends it to a person he is deciding about, which meant the 11 seconds were not a countdown he had started against her. They were a space he had opened, on purpose, and was standing inside with her, waiting to see what she would put in it. He had not raised the alarm. He was choosing not to, second by second, and the choice was still live, and it was hers to lose. 6 seconds. She had 6 before his patience or his orders won out over whatever strange courtesy had made him speak her name instead of ending her. 6 seconds to give the man a reason. So she gave him one. And I'll tell you exactly what she did with those 6 seconds in the next breath, because it is the smallest, quietest, most outrageous thing in this entire file, and once you see it, you will understand why a colonel let an enemy walk down his staircase and out into the Vienna night, and why neither of them would say a word about it for the 7 years that followed. What she did was nothing, and nothing was the most exact and dangerous thing she could possibly have done. Let me be precise, because the genius is in the precision. She did not flinch at her own name, and the not flinching cost her more than any sprint ever could have, because every nerve in her body was screaming to react, and she spent the first of her 6 seconds spending none of it. She let her face do the thing a guest's face does when a stranger speaks to it in a language that guest is not supposed to fully understand. A small, polite, uncomprehending warmth. The faint apologetic smile of a woman who has heard a man say something and assumes, charitably, that he has mistaken her for someone else. She tilted her head a degree. She let her eyes hold his with exactly the wrong amount of recognition, which is to say none, the open empty friendliness of a person to whom the name he'd just spoken meant nothing at all. It was a lie told entirely with the muscles of the face, and it was not meant to fool him. She knew, in the second, that it could not possibly fool him, that he knew precisely who she was, and that her blank smile was itself a kind of answer. The smile was not for his belief. The smile was for his record. She was handing him a version of events he could choose to have witnessed. She was building him a door he could walk back out through, a story in which he had called a name across a landing, and a confused interpreter had smiled at him and gone on her way, and nothing had happened, and there was nothing to report, because to report it would be to admit he had recognized a foreign officer mid-operation and let her go. With one tilt of her head, she made his silence cheaper than his alarm. That was the second. The third second she gave to her body, and what she did with it was begin to move, not away. That was the trap. Away is flight, and flight is confession. She began to move down, toward him. The staircase went down past where he stood at its head, and the only way out of that building was down those stairs. And so she did the thing that every instinct on earth told her not to do, which was descend toward the man who had just spoken her death over her, with the unhurried economy of a guest who has finished upstairs and is rejoining the party. Her low heel found the first marble tread. Her hand came to rest light on the gilt rail, for feet of polished brass, and roughly that same distance of open air between her descending shoulder and his standing one. She did not look at him as she came. She looked down at the stairs the way a careful woman looks at stairs, and that downward angle of her face did two things at once. It sold the lie of the harmless guest minding her footing, and it took her eyes off him in a gesture of such complete unconcern that it was, in its own silent grammar, the loudest thing she could have said. It said, "I am not afraid of you." It said, "You are not going to do this." It said, "I have read you exactly as well as you have read me, and I am betting my life on the read, and I am betting it calmly." That is what she put in the space he'd opened. Not pleading. Not a deal. Contempt's gentler cousin, the thing professionals respect more than any other thing in the world, composure. The refusal to give him the fear he had every right to expect. The 4 second belonged to him, and she felt it pass over her like a shadow as she drew level with where he stood. This was the second the whole thing could die in. For feet to her left, close enough that she could smell the cologne and the faint undertone of cigarettes that no amount of cologne ever fully covers, stood a man who had only to reach out, only to speak one more sentence, only to lift the phone on the wall behind him, and the marble grandeur all around them would turn instantly into a cage. She did not look. She kept descending. And in that 4 second, in the very corner of her vision that she would never afterward be able to swear she'd truly seen or only constructed from what came after, his hand on the gilt rail did not move toward the phone. It stayed where it was, and his head turned, slowly, tracking her descent, the way a man watches something he has decided is rare and is choosing to let live. He said nothing more. The name he had spoken hung in the air and got no answer, and slowly, in the silence she refused to fill, it began to mean nothing, the way an unanswered question always eventually does. For seconds gone. She was past him. His shoulder was behind hers now, and the long flight of marble lay open below, and the worst of it was over, except that with a man like that the worst of it is never the part where you can see his hands. The 5th second she spent not running. I cannot stress to you how much that cost, and how much it mattered. Everything in her wanted to take those last stairs 3 at a time, to put marble and distance and crowd between her spine and that charcoal suit, and she knew with the cold part of her brain that the instant she broke into anything faster than a guest's idle descent, she would convert his decision back into a question. She would hand him a fleeing target and an excuse. She would undo with her feet everything she had bought with her face. So she walked. She walked down the lower flight at the precise pace of a woman who has nowhere in particular to be, her breathing slow because she made it slow, her shoulders loose because she ordered them loose, and the noise of the reception came back up to meet her, the warm wash of 200 voices, and clinking glasses rising from the ballroom like a tide coming back over the stone. And she let it take her in. By the bottom of the stairs she was, to anyone watching, simply a guest returning. she stepped off the last tread onto the ballroom floor and into the crowd and the light, and she did not look back. And that, the not looking back, was the 6th second, the last one, the one she spent buying the only thing she had left to buy, which was the appearance of a woman who had no reason on earth to look back, because nothing at all had happened on those stairs. And here is the part the file leaves out, the part one had to sit with for a long time before I understood it, the part that makes this not a chase story, but something rarer. Down in the bright loud ballroom, swallowed safe inside the crowd, Sarah did the bravest thing she did all night. She turned around. Not in fear. She had the seconds for it now. She had the cover of the crowd. She could be just one more guest glancing idly back toward the staircase she'd come down. She turned and she looked up to the head of the stairs where he still stood, and she met his eyes one last time across the whole bright width of that room full of suits and gowns and chandelier light, because she needed to know, and because a professional always confirms. And Volkov, looking down at her over 2 stories of marble and 100 oblivious diplomats, did the thing I will be thinking about for the rest of my life. He raised his glass. Not high. Not a toast for anyone to see. He lifted the champagne flute in his hand perhaps an inch off level, a motion so small that no one in that entire room caught it but her, and he inclined his head a fraction, and that was all. That was the entire message, delivered in the only language 2 people like that could ever safely use. It said I saw you. It said you were good. It said I let you go, and we both know it, and neither of us will ever say so. The blood-orange light of the chandelier caught the rim of the glass as he lifted it, one small burning point of warmth in all the cold marble, and then he turned and was gone back into the party, and Sarah turned too, and walked to the interpreter station, and picked up her water, and was back in her post with the clone secrets warm against her hip a full minute before anyone who mattered had noticed she was ever gone. Sit with that a second, because I want you to understand what just happened, and it is not what your action movies have trained you to think happened. There was no fight. Nobody won by being faster or stronger or louder. A woman walked into a room built to make her feel small, did the most delicate work there is, and when the one man in Europe who could have ended her looked her dead in the face and spoke her true name, she beat him not with a weapon, and not with a lie he believed, but with the one thing he could not help but respect. She refused to be afraid. And in refusing, she made his mercy cheaper than his cruelty, and she walked out. 6 seconds. That's all it took, and the 6 seconds only worked because of the 9 weeks, and the 10 years, and the whole life of noticing that stood behind them. The amateur thinks the moment is the thing. The professional knows the moment is just the place where everything you already are finally shows up. Sarah had spent her entire life becoming the woman who could spend those 6 seconds correctly. When the floor opened, she didn't have to find the answer. She already was it. I'll tell you something now, off the record, the way I only do with you. I had a friend once, Maggie, you've heard me mention her, who used to say that the loud ones are easy and the quiet ones will break your heart, and I never fully understood her until I read this file. The loud man takes up all the room, so you'll never see what he's afraid of. The quiet one takes up no room at all, and you'll never see what she's capable of until the day she decides to show you, and by then it's already done. Volkov was the loud kind, the big presence, the weather system, and he was good, he was genuinely good, good enough to spot a ghost 3 years out of a sealed file. But Sarah was the other kind. The kind the room forgets it ever saw. And I think this is why he raised the glass. I think he had spent his whole loud career being seen, and somewhere in him was a tired professional who recognized in that calm descending woman the thing he'd given up being able to do himself. which is to win without anyone ever knowing there'd been a fight. You respect in others what you've lost in yourself. He let her go because she was the better artist, and he knew it, and the only honest thing left to do was lift his glass an inch and let her walk. That should be the end of it. For most files, that's where the black bars take over and the story just stops. A clone delivered, a flight home, a woman who never existed having done a thing that never happened. But this one has one more page, and it's 2 years on and 700 miles away, and it's the page that turned a clean exit into the strangest kind of friendship two enemies can have, and I want to take you there before I let you go. Cool your glass. There's a hotel in Zurich, and a second look across a second room, and I haven't told you yet what it meant that neither of them ran. 2 years is a long time in a short life like theirs, and a great deal happened in it that I'm not permitted to lay out for you, so I'll do what the file does and skip across the surface of those 2 years like a stone, touching only what I'm allowed to touch. The clone went where clones go. What was on it mattered. I can tell you that much, because the shape of what came after says it plainly even when the words won't. Things that were supposed to happen quietly happened loudly instead, and somewhere a careful plan came apart at a seam that no one could trace, and a handful of people who were never named got to keep being alive because a woman in a dark dress spent 90 seconds in a borrowed office in Vienna. Sarah flew home. She was debriefed and commended in a room with no windows by men who would deny the room existed, and then she did the thing her trade demands, which is the hardest thing of all. She put it down and walked away from it and became, on paper, and in the eyes of the world, a freelance interpreter with a quiet flat and a string of dull legitimate jobs, and she did not speak of Vienna to anyone. Because the people you could speak to weren't allowed to listen, and the people who'd listen could never be allowed to know. She carried it the way they all carry it, folded small, locked into one room at the center of the house. And Volkov carried something too, though I'm guessing at the shape of his version, because his file isn't mine to read and never will be. But I've been doing this long enough to know what a man like that carries away from a night like that, and I'd bet my pension it kept him up the same way it kept her up, the not saying of it. Because understand, he had a choice to live with now too. He had stood at the head of a staircase with a foreign officer dead to rights, and he had let her walk, and that was a thing he could never report and never explain and never take back. A small private treason of the heart that no one would ever know about but the two of them. She owed her life to his silence. He owed his career, maybe his own life depending on the men he answered to hers. They were bound now, the way only two people can be bound who each hold the other's destruction in a closed hand and have silently agreed, across a ballroom, to keep the hand closed. That's not friendship. It's not even trust, not the way you and I would mean it. It's something older and colder, and somehow cleaner than either. Two professionals who looked at each other across the lines that were supposed to make them kill each other, and recognized, and chose mercy, and would now spend the rest of their lives being the only two people on earth who knew what the other was truly capable of. Zurich, 2 Octobers later. A hotel on the lake whose name I'll keep to myself, the kind of old-money quiet place where the carpet eats your footsteps and the staff have perfected the art of seeing nothing, the kind of neutral ground where people from opposite sides of the world's invisible wars come to sit in the same lobby and pretend they're all just here for the banking. Sarah was working, legitimately, a real conference, real headphones, a real and tedious week of trade language, and she had come down into the lobby bar in the slack hour before dinner to sit alone with a glass of wine and the particular tiredness of a long day spent speaking in other people's words. She had her back to the room out of habit that was no longer quite habit, angled so the long mirror behind the bar gave her the door. Because some things you never put down even when you put everything else down. And in the mirror, between one sip and the next, she watched a tall, broad-shouldered man in a good gray suit coming out of the Zurich evening, and stop, and stand for a moment letting his eyes move across the room the way men like him always move their eyes across a room, and find her. In the mirror, looking back at him, they saw each other the way they'd seen each other the first time, instantly, completely, with the involuntary recognition of two people who could each pick the other's face out of 10,000 faces in the dark. Now here is where you brace for the thing the movies promised you. Here is where one of them sets down the glass too carefully, where a hand drifts toward a pocket, where the air goes tight, and somebody moves first. That is the story we've all been trained to expect, and it is exactly the story that did not happen, and the fact that it did not happen is the whole point I've been carrying you toward this entire time. Neither of them ran. Neither of them reached. Neither of them stood, or signaled, or did any of the dozen things that two enemies who'd caught each other on neutral ground might be expected to do. Volkov looked at her across the long quiet lobby for the space of perhaps 3 full seconds, gray and unhurried, and then he did the same thing he'd done at the head of a marble staircase 700 miles and 2 years before. He inclined his head. A fraction. The smallest possible motion a man can make and still mean it as a greeting, a nod that no one else in that lobby would have caught or understood, that meant across all the language they were forbidden to speak. There you are. You're still alive. I'm glad of it. We're still keeping the hand closed. And Sarah, in the mirror, holding his eyes, returned it. The same fraction. The same nothing that was everything. And then, and this is the detail that finished me, the small human thing the file actually kept. One unredacted line in a page of black bars. He did not come over. He did not test the truce or push his luck or indulge whatever curiosity a man must feel about the woman who'd beaten him at his own quiet game. He turned and crossed to the front desk and checked in like the businessman his passport that week said he was, and he took his key and went to the elevator and was gone, and he did not look back at her, because looking back would have meant something, and the entire grace of the thing was that they had agreed, without a word, ever, to make sure none of it ever meant anything that anyone could see. She finished her wine. He never came down to that bar again the nights they overlapped, and she understood why, and was grateful for it, because his absence was a courtesy, the same courtesy as the inch of glass on the staircase. The courtesy of a man making sure his existence cost her nothing. They were in the same hotel for 4 more days. They never spoke. They never would. As far as I can tell from a file that goes quiet after that, they never saw each other again for the rest of their lives, and the whole of what passed between them across all those years amounts to one spoken name, one raised glass, and 2 small inclinations of the head. And inside those 3 tiny things, 2 entire human beings, fully known to each other and to no one else on earth. So let me tell you what I think this story is about, now that you've heard all of it, because it isn't about a clone or a colonel or 6 seconds on a staircase. Not really. Those are just the bones. What it's about is the thing we almost never let ourselves believe is real, which is that the line between enemies is drawn by men in rooms, and the respect between professionals is drawn by something a good deal harder to legislate. Volkov was on the other side. By every rule that's written down, he should have ended her, and by every rule he'd have been right too, and the men he answered to would have pinned a medal on him for it. He let her go because he'd watched her be better than he was at the one thing they both worshipped, and because somewhere underneath the uniform, and the directorate, and the whole vast cold machinery of 2 countries that wanted each other's secrets, There was a man who would rather lose to an artist than win against a fool. That's not weakness. Don't you ever let anybody tell you that's weakness. That's the rarest strength there is, the strength to recognize greatness in the one place you're commanded to hate it, and to honor it anyway, quietly, where it costs you everything and earns you nothing but the knowledge that you stayed human in a job designed to burn the human out of you. And Sarah's the lesson I most want you to take up off the table and put in your pocket and carry out of here, because she's the one most like us, the quiet one the room forgot. She didn't beat the colonel because she was faster or harder or louder. She beat him by being completely, calmly, unshakably herself in the one moment that would have shattered almost anyone, and she could only do that because she had spent her whole life becoming a woman who would not shatter. The 6 seconds were free. The 40 years that made the 6 seconds possible cost her everything other people get to have: a name she could use, a story she could tell, a husband who'd know what she'd done, children who'd brag about a mother whose medals don't officially exist. She paid in a currency you can't see, and she paid it without complaint, and the only receipt she ever got was an inch of champagne glass lifted by an enemy who understood. Some wars are won across a ballroom, friend, not a battlefield. And the people who win them walk back into the loud, bright party afterward and pick up a glass of water and answer to a name that isn't theirs, and you will never, ever know their faces, and that anonymous, unthanked composure is its own towering kind of courage, and I wanted at least one of them to have a name spoken out loud for once, even if it's only here, even if it's only by me, even if it's only to you. That's Sarah Chen, Captain, United States Army. The woman with 6 seconds and the nerve to use them slow. Now, before you go, I told you at the start that this file shouldn't exist, and it shouldn't, and the fact that you heard it means somebody decided you should, and I've made my peace with not knowing who or why. But I'll leave you with this, because the next one's already pulling at me, and I can't put it down. Sarah had 6 seconds and a clean exit. She had marble under her feet, and a glass of champagne for an enemy, and a quiet staircase to walk down into the rest of her life. The next one I want to tell you about didn't have 6 seconds. She had 4 minutes, and they were the longest 4 minutes I've ever read about, and at the end of them, there were 7 men bleeding into the sand of a valley in Helmand, and one woman deciding, alone, who among them was going to live. No marble there. No champagne. No honorable enemy across a quiet room. Just the heat and the dust, and the dead weight of men she loved, and a choice nobody should ever have to make. I'll need a steadier hand to tell you that one, and you might need a steadier glass to hear it. If this one got into you the way it got into me, if you sat through 6 seconds on a staircase and felt your own breath go shallow, then do the small thing that keeps these stories coming. Subscribe. Stay. These women paid in a currency nobody ever cashes, and the least we can do, you and I, is make sure their names get said out loud in a room where somebody's listening. Pour yourself something. I'll see you next Sunday.